The air in Blackwater Creek was thick with dust and tension as Delia O'Connor stumbled through the batwing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a firm hand on her back propelling her forward with such force she nearly lost her footing. The year was 1876, and the remote Wyoming Territory town had seen its share of desperate souls, but something about the fear in Delia's emerald eyes caught the attention of every patron in the establishment. "Got a new girl for you, Madam Ruby," drawled Vernon Slater, the town's most notorious land grabber, as he shoved Delia toward a heavy-set woman dressed in crimson silk. "Her pa's debt is now settled." Delia's auburn hair fell across her face as she regained her balance, momentarily hiding the purple-yellow bruise blooming along her cheekbone. At 22, she had endured more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up to them, and after his passing just 3 days prior, Slater had appeared at their small homestead with a contract bearing her father's signature, a contract that had effectively sold her into servitude at the Silver Dollar. "I won't do this," Delia whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't make me." Slater's response was swift, a backhand that sent her reeling against the bar, exposing more bruises on her arms where her sleeve had ridden up. The entire saloon fell silent, save for the slow scrape of a chair being pushed back from a corner table. West Everett, known to most simply as West, stood to his full height of 6 feet 3 inches, his weathered Stetson casting a shadow over piercing blue eyes. At 30, he'd earned his reputation as one of the territory's most respected cattle drivers, with scars to match the stories told about him. "That's no way to treat a lady," West's deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. His hand rested casually on his holstered Colt, but there was nothing casual about the steel in his gaze. "Mind your business, cowboy," Slater spat. "This one belongs to the house now." West moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd faced down charging bulls and gun-toting outlaws without flinching. He stepped between Delia and Slater, taking note of the tears streaking down her dirt-smudged face and the constellation of bruises visible on her pale skin. "I reckon I'm making it my business," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll make sure you're safe, miss." Madam Ruby, ever the businesswoman, stepped forward with a placating gesture. "Gentlemen, please, this establishment thrives on civility." "There's nothing civil about forcing a woman against her will," West countered, never taking his eyes off Slater. Delia stood frozen, caught between disbelief that someone would intervene on her behalf and terror of what would happen next. Her entire life had been spent on a small ranch outside of town, helping her father after her mother's death from fever 6 years ago. The Silver Dollar had always been a place she hurried past with downcast eyes. "The debt is legal and binding," Slater insisted, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. "Her father put her up as collateral, clear as day." West's expression didn't change as he said, "How much?" "What?" Slater blinked. "The debt, how much?" $250, Slater replied with a smirk. Knowing it was a small fortune, without hesitation, West reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. "I just sold 60 head of cattle to the Army at Fort Laramie. I reckon I can cover that and then some." He tossed the pouch to Slater, who caught it reflexively. "Consider the debt paid." Slater weighed the pouch in his hand, his expression darkening. "This ain't about the money anymore, Everett. You're meddling where you don't belong." "Maybe so," West agreed calmly. "But I've never been one to walk away when something ain't right." He turned slightly toward Delia. "Miss, if you'd prefer not to work here, you're free to go." Delia's eyes widened, darting between West, Slater, and Madam Ruby. Freedom was being offered by a stranger while every instinct told her there had to be a catch. "He can't do this," Slater protested to Ruby. "We had an arrangement," Ruby sighed dramatically. "If the debt's been paid, Vernon, I've no claim on the girl, and frankly, I prefer my girl's willing." "Less trouble." Slater's face contorted with rage. In one fluid motion, his hand moved to his gun, but West was faster. The cowboy didn't draw his weapon, he simply stepped forward and delivered a precise blow to Slater's jaw that sent him crashing into a nearby table. The saloon erupted into chaos as patrons scrambled away from the falling bodies. West turned to Delia and extended his hand. "We should leave now, miss." Delia hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. The simple human contact, gentle, without demand or cruelty, nearly undid her. West led her quickly through the batwing doors and into the dusty main street of Blackwater Creek. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they hurried away from the Silver Dollar. "I don't understand," Delia finally said when they'd put several buildings between themselves and the saloon. "Why would you help me? What do you want in return?" West stopped and turned to face her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Nothing, miss. I've seen what happens to women forced into that life. Couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Delia searched his face for deception, but found only sincerity in his weathered features. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. "Our ranch will be Slater's by now." "I've got a room at the boarding house," West offered. "Mrs. Peterson is a respectable widow. You can stay there tonight and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "I can't accept charity," Delia protested weakly, though her options were painfully limited. "Then consider it a loan," West replied with a slight smile. "You can pay me back when you're on your feet." As they walked toward the boarding house at the edge of town, Delia became acutely aware of her appearance: dirt-streaked face, torn dress, and disheveled hair. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a small locket containing a miniature portrait of her mother. Mrs. Peterson, a stern but kind-hearted woman in her 60s, took one look at Delia's bruised face and ushered her inside without question. West explained the situation in hushed tones, while Mrs. Peterson prepared a basin of warm water and clean towels. "You can stay in the room across from Mr. Everett's," Mrs. Peterson declared. "I don't usually allow single women, but these are unusual circumstances." Left alone in the small but tidy room, Delia finally allowed herself to cry, not from pain or fear, but from overwhelming relief. She had been moments away from a life she couldn't bear to contemplate, saved by a stranger who wanted nothing in return. It seemed too good to be true, and experience had taught her that such things usually were. The following morning, Delia awoke to find a simple blue dress and white blouse hanging on the door. A note in a neat, masculine hand read, "Miss O'Connor, Mrs. Peterson thought these might fit you. I'll be downstairs when you're ready to talk about what comes next. W.E." The clothes belonged to Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who had moved to Denver years ago. They fit well enough, and Delia found comfort in the clean fabric against her skin. When she descended the narrow staircase, she found West seated at the dining table, nursing a cup of coffee. He stood when she entered, removing his hat. Without the shadow of the saloon, Delia could see him clearly for the first time. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. "Thank you," Delia said simply, taking the seat he offered. "For everything." "Don't mention it," West replied. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better," she admitted, "but lost. I don't know what to do now." West nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. I'm heading to my ranch tomorrow. It's about 20 miles north of here. I could use help around the place, and there's a small cabin where you could stay. It's nothing fancy, but it's private and safe." Delia stiffened. "I told you I won't accept charity." "It's not charity if you're working," West countered. "I need someone to cook meals and tend to the house while I'm out with the cattle. My last housekeeper left to get married 3 months ago, and I've been living like a bachelor since." Delia considered his offer. A job and a place to stay seemed too convenient, but she had few alternatives. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked frankly. West's expression remained open. "You don't. But Mrs. Peterson can vouch for my character, and I give you my word that you'll be treated with respect. If at any time you feel uncomfortable, I'll bring you back to town or help you find passage elsewhere." Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, interjected, "West Everett is as honorable as they come, dear. I've known him for 5 years, and he's never given anyone reason to think otherwise." Delia took a deep breath. "All right, I accept your offer, Mr. Everett, at least until I can make other arrangements." "West," he corrected with a smile. "Everyone calls me West." The journey to the Everett Ranch took most of the following day. West had purchased a sturdy mare for Delia to ride, insisting it was a business expense since she would need transportation around the property. They traveled in companionable silence for much of the way, with West occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the territory. By late afternoon, they crested a hill that overlooked a valley bisected by a clear, winding creek. A modest but well-maintained ranch house stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings nearby. Cattle grazed on the lush grass that spread across the valley floor. "Welcome to the Circle E," West said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine, free and clear." Delia was struck by the beauty of the place, so different from her father's struggling ranch with its patched fences and leaking roof. "It's lovely," she said honestly. As they approached, a stocky man with graying hair emerged from the barn, followed by a lanky young man who couldn't have been more than 19. "That's Frank Miller, my foreman," West explained. "And his son Thomas. They live in a cabin about a quarter-mile downstream." Frank greeted them with a tip of his hat, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Good to have you back, boss. Everything's running smooth." His eyes moved curiously to Delia. "Frank, Thomas, this is Miss Delia O'Connor," West introduced. "She'll be taking over as housekeeper." If Frank was surprised, he didn't show it. "Pleased to meet you, Miss O'Connor. About time this place had a woman's touch again." Thomas mumbled a greeting, his face reddening as he stared at his boots. Delia offered a shy smile in return, acutely aware of how strange her situation must appear to others. The cabin West had mentioned was actually a small but well-built structure about 50 yards from the main house. It had previously served as the home for his married foreman before Frank took over the position. Inside was a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a chest of drawers. "I know it's simple," West apologized, "but it's yours for as long as you want it." The main house has a proper kitchen where you'll do most of the cooking, but you can prepare your own meals here if you prefer privacy. "It's perfect," Delia assured him, moved by the consideration he'd shown. After the events of the past few days, having a space of her own felt like an unimaginable luxury. They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Delia rose early to prepare breakfast for West and any hands who were working that day. She cleaned the main house, tended to a small kitchen garden, and prepared lunch and dinner. In her free time, she explored the property or read from West's surprisingly extensive library. West, for his part, maintained a respectful distance. He was unfailingly polite, expressing appreciation for her cooking and keeping her informed of his comings and goings. If he noticed how she sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly, or how she avoided being alone with Thomas despite the young man's obvious infatuation, he didn't mention it. As May turned to June, Delia felt herself relaxing into her new life. The bruises faded, and with them, some of her wariness. She found unexpected joy in simple things: the satisfaction of baking a perfect loaf of bread, the beauty of wildflowers blooming along the creek, the peaceful sound of rain on the cabin roof. One evening, as Delia was finishing the dinner dishes, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windows of the main house. She hurried to close the last window when lightning struck nearby, illuminating the yard in stark white light. In that flash, she saw a rider approaching, a familiar silhouette that sent ice through her veins. Vernon Slater had found her. West entered the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Storm's getting bad. I'll walk you to your cabin when," he stopped, noticing her expression. "What's wrong, Slater?" she whispered, backing away from the window. "He's here." West's face hardened as he moved to look outside. "Stay here," he instructed, reaching for the rifle mounted above the door. Before he could step outside, the front door burst open. Slater stood in the entryway, water streaming from his duster and hat, his expression twisted with anger and something darker. "Found you at last," he slurred, clearly drunk. "Thought you could just run off with my property?" West positioned himself between Delia and the intruder, rifle raised. "You're trespassing, Slater. The debt's been paid. She doesn't owe you anything." Slater laughed, a harsh sound that raised the hair on Delia's arms. "This ain't about the money anymore, Everett. It's about respect. Can't have people thinking Vernon Slater lets a cowboy and a whore make a fool of him." "I'm not a whore," Delia said, stepping forward despite her fear. "And I was never your property." "Brave words from a woman hiding behind a man with a gun," Slater sneered, his hand hovering near his holster. Last chance to leave peacefully, West warned, his voice level but edged with steel. For a moment. The only sound was the rain hammering against the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Then Slater's hand twitched toward his gun. West fired a single shot, striking the wood floor at Slater's feet. That was a warning. The next one won't be. Slater froze, his face contorted with rage and surprise. This ain't over, he spat, backing toward the door, not by a long shot. After Slater had disappeared into the storm, West secured the door and moved through the house, checking windows and locks. Delia remained in the kitchen, hands trembling as she gripped the back of a chair for support. He'll be back, she said when West returned. He's not the type to let things go. West nodded grimly. I know, but we'll be ready. He hesitated, then added, It might be best if you don't stay alone in the cabin tonight. Delia's eyes widened and West quickly clarified, I meant you should take my room. I'll sleep down here by the fire, keep watch. The simplicity of his offer protection without expectation brought unexpected tears to Delia's eyes. Thank you, she managed, for everything. That night, lying in West's bed surrounded by his belongings, books on the nightstand, a silver pocket watch on the dresser, a faded photograph of a woman who might have been his mother, Delia realized something had shifted between them. The distance that had felt necessary and comforting now seemed like an unnecessary barrier. In the days that followed, West arranged for one of the ranch hands to remain near the main house at all times. Frank and Thomas took turns patrolling the property, and West himself rarely ventured far from the house. The protective measures should have made Delia feel safer, but instead, she found herself increasingly frustrated by the constraints on her freedom. I can't live like this, she told West one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. Always looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to return. West studied her for a moment before responding. What do you want to do? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in so long. I don't know, she admitted, but I refuse to let fear dictate my life anymore. The next morning, Delia woke with newfound determination. She prepared breakfast as usual, then surprised West by announcing she wanted to learn to shoot. Are you sure? He asked, searching her face. Positive, she replied firmly. I need to be able to protect myself. That afternoon, West set up targets behind the barn and presented Delia with a Remington pocket revolver. It was my mother's, he explained. Small enough for a woman's hand, but powerful enough to stop a man if necessary. Delia's first attempts were wildly off target, the recoil stronger than she'd expected. But she persisted day after day until she could hit the center mark more often than not. West proved to be a patient teacher, correcting her stance with gentle guidance and offering encouragement even when she grew frustrated. As summer progressed, their relationship evolved. Delia no longer hurried back to her cabin after dinner, but lingered on the porch with West, sharing stories of their lives before Blackwater Creek. She learned that he had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, working as a cowhand before saving enough to buy his own land. He discovered that she had once dreamed of being a schoolteacher before her mother's death left her responsible for caring for her father. One particularly warm evening in late July, as they watched fireflies dancing over the meadow, West said quietly, I never asked why your father was in debt to Slater. Delia sighed, the painful memories no longer quite so raw. After my mother died, he started drinking, then gambling. He was convinced the next hand would be the one to change our fortune. She twisted the locket around her neck, a nervous habit. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, he'd already put up our ranch as collateral. And you, West asked softly, how did you become part of the deal? Delia's fingers stilled on the locket. I don't know exactly. The night before he died, Slater came to the ranch. They argued in Pa's study for hours. When Slater left, Pa was drinking heavily, saying he'd fixed everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper. 3 days later, he was dead. His heart gave out, and Slater showed up with that contract. West's hand covered hers, warm and steady. I'm sorry, he said simply. The touch of his hand sent a flutter through Delia's chest that had nothing to do with grief or fear. When she looked up to meet his eyes, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Before either could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. West was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his gun. "It's just me, boss." Thomas Miller's voice called out as he rode into the yard. "Got word from town you'll want to hear." The young man dismounted, nodding respectfully to Delia before turning to West. "Sheriff Wilson arrested Slater this morning. Caught him trying to burn down the bank after Jennings foreclosed on his properties." Delia gasped. "All of them?" Thomas nodded eagerly. "Every last one. Turns out he's been forging documents and cheating folks for years." Sheriff found a whole stack of bogus contracts in his office, including one with your father's signature, Miss O'Connor. The news was overwhelming. After months of looking over her shoulder, the threat Slater posed was suddenly removed. More than that, the contract that had nearly condemned her to a life of servitude was exposed as a forgery. "They're sending him to territorial prison in Laramie," Thomas continued. "Sheriff says he'll likely get 10 years at least." After Thomas departed to share the news with his father, Delia and West remained on the porch in stunned silence. Finally, Delia spoke. "I'm free," she whispered, the reality of it slowly sinking in. "Truly free," West nodded, a shadow passing over his features. "Yes. You can go anywhere you want now." The implication hung in the air between them. With Slater no longer a threat, Delia had no reason to remain at the Circle E. The realization brought not joy but an unexpected ache. "Where would I go?" she asked softly. West met her gaze, something vulnerable in his blue eyes. "That's for you to decide. You could still become a teacher if that's what you want." Delia stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the ranch that had become home in just a few short months. "And if I wanted to stay?" She heard West rise and move to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without touching. "Then you'd make me the happiest man in Wyoming Territory," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Delia turned to face him, her heart pounding. "I'm not the same frightened girl you rescued from the silver dollar. I don't need saving anymore." "I know," West replied, a smile warming his features. "That's why I'm asking you to stay not as my housekeeper but as my partner, if you'll have me." In answer, Delia reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar along his jawline with gentle fingers. West remained perfectly still, allowing her to take the lead. When she rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his, he responded with a tenderness that made her heart soar. The kiss deepened, months of unspoken feelings finally finding expression. When they finally parted, both breathless, West rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Delia O'Connor," he whispered. "I think I have since that first day in the saloon when you stood up to Slater despite your fear." Delia smiled, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "And I love you, West Everett. You gave me my freedom when you could have taken advantage, and for that I'll always be grateful." "I don't want your gratitude," West said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Just your heart." "You've had that for longer than I care to admit," Delia confessed with a laugh. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Blackwater Creek. Mrs. Peterson insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, where Delia and West had first begun their journey together. Frank Miller served as best man, while Thomas escorted Delia down the aisle in place of her father. As summer turned to fall, Delia and West moved into the main house together. The small cabin was converted into a schoolroom where Delia began teaching the children of neighboring ranchers 3 days a week. Her dream of becoming a teacher hadn't died after all, it had simply waited for the right time and place. Winter brought heavy snow and long evenings by the fire, where West read aloud from his favorite books while Delia worked on a quilt for their bed. They talked about the future, about expanding the ranch and perhaps starting a family of their own when the time was right. On Christmas morning, West presented Delia with a deed to her father's old ranch, which he had purchased at auction after Slater's arrest. "It's yours," he told her as she stared at the document in disbelief. "To sell, to keep, or to turn into something new, whatever you decide, I'll support you." Tears filled Delia's eyes as she embraced her husband. "I don't need the land," she said. "Everything I want is right here." But the gesture, the gift of choice, meant more than West could know. In the spring, they planted a garden together outside the main house, with flowers as well as vegetables. Delia insisted on wildflowers, reminiscent of those that had given her such pleasure during her first days at the Circle E. "For remembrance," she explained when West questioned the practicality of dedicating good soil to flowers that grew naturally in the meadow. "What are we remembering?" he asked, placing his hands on her waist as they stood surveying their work. Delia turned in his arms, her face glowing with contentment. That beauty can grow from the darkest places. That second chances are possible. She kissed him softly. That sometimes being forced into a saloon can lead to finding the love of your life. West laughed, the sound rich and free. I thank God every day that I was there when you needed someone. Not just someone, Delia corrected, resting her head against his chest. You. As they stood together in the garden they had created, with the ranch spreading out around them and the future stretching endless before them, Delia marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the darkest day of her life had come her greatest happiness, proof that even in the wild frontier, where danger and hardship were constant companions, love could flourish like wildflowers after rain. Years later, when their children asked how they met, West would always start the story the same way. I saw her standing in the $silver saloon, bruised but unbowed, and I knew right then I'd do whatever it took to keep her safe. And Delia would always finish it. What he didn't know was that in saving me, he was saving himself too. That's how love works. It heals both the heart that gives it and the heart that receives it. And in the telling and retelling, their love story became part of the fabric of the Circle E, as enduring as the land itself, and as constant as the Wyoming sky stretching blue and boundless above them.